Welcome to EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. I'm your host, Russ Roberts of George Mason University and Stanford University's Hoover Institution. Our website is econtalk.org, where you can subscribe, find other episodes, comment on this podcast, and find links and other information related to today's conversation. Our email address is mail@econtalk.org. We'd love to hear from you. Today is December 14th, 2011, and my guest is Alex Tabarrok of George Mason University. His latest book is Launching the Innovation Renaissance. It's an ebook available for Kindle et al. At Amazon and elsewhere for $2.99. It's a TED book. Alex has a TED Talk based related to the book. Alex, welcome to EconTalk.
Great to be here.
So I want to start with the problem the book is proposing to fix, or at least improve, which is our innovation situation in the United States. I think most people still see the United States as a very innovative place, maybe not in 2011 because our economy is not doing very well, but it's still considered a place and source of innovation. So why is there a concern about the current levels of innovation and entrepreneurship in the United States?
Well, innovation is one of those things that more is better.
Yes.
So I think we would certainly like more. Now, I do take for granted in this book what my colleague Tyler Cowen has called the Great Stagnation. Whether you call it a great or modest stagnation, it is true that since about 1973, the rate of productivity growth in the United States has been below its trend for 1947 to about 1973. And we've been falling below that. And as you know, productivity is the single most important factor in creating a high standard of living. When we can do more with less, that is better than anything else. And so when our productivity levels are less than what they might be, that's going to be a subject for concern.
Yeah, I certainly agree with that. I certainly was part of that, which is that more is better, and I wish we had an even more innovative economy. I think my problem with Tyler's analysis, and to some extent yours, although you don't rely on many of the things that Tyler relies on, if you just look at the raw productivity numbers from 47 to 73, it's not like it slowed down in 1973. It's that it suddenly changed its slope dramatically. So there's a puzzle there that I suspect has something to do possibly with slower productivity, although that's a little hard to understand given that the last 20, 30 years have been extremely innovative, at least in our everyday lives. We look around, we see lots of innovation. We also had a big change in the nature of our economy over those 60 years that we're talking about. We've had a steady decline in manufacturing as a source of employment and a steady, but still a very productive manufacturing sector because of the innovation that's taken place there. So I'm a little puzzled by those numbers. I don't think, again, if it's one thing to say, well, it's slowed down. If you see an abrupt change like that, you really have to look for things around 1973. And I see post-73 being pretty innovative relative to pre-73. If it's not in the data, maybe the data are not measuring some of the gains that are out there. And of course, as we move to a more increasingly service sector-oriented economy, those innovation gains are going to get smaller. It's going to be part of the problem.
That's possible. I think it is very difficult to get an intuitive sense of how much innovation is a lot and what we might expect. So I do like this intuitive idea of thinking if we go back 60 years, 1950, we think about 1950 and it's basically a modern world. It's less advanced than our world, but you have television, you've got radio, you have airplanes, you even have a few large computers are around. Yep. But it's pretty much a modern world.
Cars. You meant
cars,
you didn't say cars,
absolutely.
But cars,
yeah, sure. Now you go back another 60 years to 1900 or so, something like that, 1890. Totally different world. And there's no airplane, there's no radio, there's no television. And the world from 1890 to 1950, that looks like an impossible change. That looks like science fiction. That doesn't look like extending out 1890. So I do think that there's also an intuitive argument for the idea that the rate of innovation has not been as high as it was in previous years.
If you go back over that time period.
Yeah. But my focus, however, is we can do better than we are doing now. So let's look at the problems that we have now and where we can do better.
And certainly, if there are barriers to innovation, which you identify in the book, then we should get rid of them if we can. So let's talk about those. So you identify a whole bunch of different problems and opportunities that aren't being taken advantage of. So the first one you mentioned is the U.S. patent system, which is a little ironic because, of course, it was put into place to preserve incentives for innovation. So make the case for and against patents. What's the argument?
I mean, the argument for patents is that imitation is a lot cheaper than innovation. So that if a firm innovates, creates something new, and another firm can come along, imitate that product, eat away all those profits, and the first firm can't recover its research and development costs.
And then they wouldn't have any incentive to do them, and therefore it won't get much innovation. That's
exactly. Then they wouldn't innovate in the first place. Yeah, exactly right. Now, there's lots of arguments against. So one of the first arguments is just to ask, are patents necessary? Because often it takes a long time to imitate a product. It's not even easy to imitate a product. So are patents necessary? And I have a number of examples. I look at roses, for example. Roses have been around for thousands of years. The Chinese emperor had hundreds of books in his library about how to propagate roses. No one has ever claimed that we don't have enough new roses. And yet, for the first time ever in 1930, we created in the Plant Patent Act, we could patent roses. So did patenting of roses lead to more beautiful roses, better looking roses?
People could capture the benefits without fear of being copied.
Exactly. Did it lead to a flowering? No, it did not. So we didn't see any big increase in rose innovation. In fact, we might have seen a little bit of a decrease. Moreover, even today, most new roses are not patented. And in fact, this is true. Most inventions, most innovations are not patented. I think people are a little bit surprised at this. But in most fields, with a few exceptions, chemicals, pharmaceuticals being really the two biggest important exceptions. So in a lot of fields, in some fields we don't even allow patents, like fashion, highly innovative, no patents at all. But in all fields, most innovations and inventions are simply not patented at all.
And you mentioned an example I've been thinking about recently, which is sports. Somebody innovates a new formation in football. It can't be patented, but coaches spend hours looking for a small edge. It's true that once you see how it works, you can copy it, but usually the person who creates it, for a variety of reasons, might be able to implement it better than the copier, either because they understand it better, either because it's theirs, they have more passion for it. And that's also true, of course, in many, many cases with ideas, that people come up with ways to make it harder to copy without using patents and the monopoly power that come with them. Certainly, there's a lot of innovation in the fashion world without patents. We had a podcast on that. We'll put a link up on that. But there are exceptions, as you point out. So you would not change, or you would not get rid of patents on pharmaceuticals. Why?
So pharmaceuticals are really the classic case of where the innovation to imitation costs are extraordinarily high. So it costs about $1 billion to create a new pharmaceutical. And to create, the first pill cost $1 billion, the second pill cost 50 cents. So that's a classic case where imitation costs really are low. So I do think there's a very good case. That's the best case for patents in a field like that. But my question is, why does every innovation deserve or require the same 20-year patent? That's crazy. Why do we have a system which gives a $1 billion pharmaceutical, where there's $1 billion in research and development costs, we give that a 20-year patent, and one-click shopping, we give it the same 20-year patent? That makes no sense whatsoever. So what I suggest is a more flexible system. I'd like to have a 20-year patent, maybe a 15-year patent, maybe a 3-year patent, something like that. And then we could say, look, you want to apply for a 3-year patent? We're going to get this through the system quickly. We won't look at it so much. If you want a 20-year patent, however,
the hurdle to make the case for it smaller.
Exactly. You want a 20-year patent, though, you'd better show us that you're really deserving. You put some costs in there.
Now, just a side note on the pharmaceuticals. I was surprised you didn't mention this. Maybe you're just trying to be strategic, but it's true it costs $1 billion to develop a new drug, but there's a reason it costs $1 billion, and a lot of that cost is to no avail. It's replicating sometimes tests that already happen in Europe. A lot of it's the regulatory structure around the drug industry, and people who are worried about drug pricing, one of the ways to solve the drug pricing problem is to remove the patent or shorten the patent. I'd like to reduce the research and development costs and the approval costs. Are you with me there?
Absolutely.
Yeah,
so,
good.
We have drug lag, and even more importantly, we have drug loss. There are lots of drugs today which probably could be invented, but people know going in the costs are just too high. So sure, I would like to see those costs come down. As a theoretical point, however, I still think that the pharmaceutical industry is the best case for a patent, in that the innovation and imitation costs are very high, but there are other things we can do to bring those costs down.
So let's talk about the expansion of patentability that's happened in the last 15 years or so, where the courts have allowed ideas to be patented, business concepts. And a lot of people, you're one, others have come forward and said this is crazy. And a point you emphasize, which I think is very compelling, is that when you make it hard, when you patent ideas, it makes it hard for people to use those ideas to create new innovation. So one of the disincentive effects of patenting is that it discourages ideas being used in creative and new ways, which are everything is, as you point out in your book, we're always standing on the shoulders of giants. The Newton quote, Newton didn't have to, as you say, didn't have to pay for it, but the rest of us are. You can say, well, that's not a big deal, so you pay for it. But the problem is that paying for it isn't so simple.
Right. So let me come back to that point in a minute. I want to give you, before we quite get there, I want to give you another example which I think is important. I want your audience to think about the most innovative U.S. company, most important innovative U.S. company that you can think of. Maybe you're thinking about Apple.
Some people would.
Some people would. That's definitely an innovative
I'm thinking
company.
about the Patriots, Bill Belichick, because I like the sports thing.
Right.
Or maybe, I don't know, fashion. I don't have any fashion expertise, as listeners know. But go ahead. Sorry.
I'm going to say Walmart.
Okay.
Now, you think about Walmart. It's the world's largest corporation, $500 billion in sales every year, estimated to have saved consumers $250 billion annually. Okay. So this is an incredibly important U.S. Corporation. And if you think about the booming 1990s, where were the big productivity gains in those in that decade? In retail, boring, 100-year-old retail industry, and yet that is where we saw really big productivity improvements. A huge chunk of that coming from Walmart. And how did they do this? Was it some new high-tech invention? No, they did it by better training of the sales staff, better training of cashiers. They did it through some, RFID chips and things like that.
Application of technology, the inventory process, a big innovation there's that clearly was not patented.
Exactly, not patented. In fact, Walmart, world's largest corporation, has about 60 patents to its name. A trivial amount, including one for a shoebox. So here we see a incredibly important, innovative U.S. company not using patents at all, and I think that's important to really remember.
It's a great point. Only caveat I would add is that 60 is a small number compared to, I think you give Microsoft's, which is in the thousands or something. But it could be that one of those 60 is the key patent that allowed them to use some sort of information technology. But I think that's not true. My guess is, as you point out, they figured out some ways to apply technology and training and other things. Everybody copied them. Target copied them. Kmart copied them. Others copied them who've disappeared because they couldn't do it as well for a whole bunch of reasons that you and I have no idea what they are. I assume it had to do with how it was implemented, who implemented it, other synergies they had with other stuff they were doing. But clearly, they were able to be innovative without it. But in the area of high tech, and then we'll get to where are we going to go after this? We're going to go back to
cumulative innovation.
Oh, and ideas.
Yeah.
So, one of the when we talk about these drawbacks to the current system and how lenient it is at allowing things to be patented that make it harder to innovate, but I look at the pace of innovation. It looks pretty good, right? I look at the gadgets and the internet. Yeah, it's kind of crazy that one click is patentable. It seems kind of crazy that people can patent ideas, business concepts. It's almost as silly as saying a podcast should be patented. Whoever had the first podcast, that was a great new invention, a radio thing on the web. But obviously that's foolish and discourages innovation and things that make the world a better place. But what's the evidence that this is causing a big problem? It does appear to be making a lot of employment for lawyers who have to deal with all these systems and make sure that they've taken care of all the intellectual property. Is there something to be worried about?
Well, I think the problem is that you may be looking for the evidence, where the lamp is, right?
Yeah.
In that, you're looking for evidence of how innovation has been reduced in highly innovative fields. But these highly innovative fields, the internet and smartphones and so forth, they've been innovative not because of these patents, but despite them. And I think the situation is becoming worse in these fields. So what we're seeing right now is firms like Google and Microsoft, they're buying up these patent arsenals. And they're not doing it because they need access to those technologies. They're doing it so that some other firm can't sue them and prevent them from innovating. Well, what's bad about that? Well, what's bad about it? I call this the mutually assured destruction. And mutually assured destruction, I think, was not the greatest way to maintain peace. Mutually assured destruction is probably not the greatest way to maintain innovation either. And I think what the real problem of this idea of innovation through strength, we will be able to innovate because we have this patent arsenal behind us, is that small firms don't have that. And so we're seeing kind of an IP feudalism.
Yeah.
We're seeing these very big companies get a hold of these arsenals so no one can attack them. But that means that the small firms can't attack them either. In fact, the small firms are being crushed. And what do we know about really disruptive, creative destruction? That often comes from the small firms. So I am worried that we are going to see, yes, you can get innovation if it's from big Google, but what about the little Google? What about the Google of 20 years ago? Yeah, the next Google.
Right, which doesn't exist because it can't have the legal department at a small size that its competitors
Exactly.
have.
So the innovation which we're not seeing, that's the invisible innovation. We're not seeing it. You can't look for where it is.
So some of my best friends are lawyers, and it turns out a lot of my best friends are intellectual property lawyers. I can think of at least 3, maybe 4 good friends of mine who are in this world, and they're the nicest people. I really mean they're good friends. They're not just people I happen to know who are IP lawyers. They, of course, not surprisingly, think that intellectual property and the expansion of property rights into this area is very natural and crucial and wonderful. They may be a little too close to the problem. So I'm wondering, and there are a lot of them,
right.
Are they an important special interest? Obviously, Google and large corporations generally are going to want to discourage small firms from innovating. Are the legal experts who spend all their hours worrying about whether this intellectual property is accessible or not and at what price and negotiating it, they have a strong stake in keeping the world as it is. Are they discouraging the kind of innovations in this area that we might want to be seeing?
In a way, though I wouldn't phrase it like that. Of course,
they're nice people.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, a IP lawyer very naturally wants to think of themselves as promoting innovation. And when you take a partial equilibrium point of view, that's probably what they're doing. But I think you have to see it in the larger picture. And I would frame it like this. So I think an incorrect framing is one which we see a lot is that it's sort of consumers versus the producers of intellectual property. And the consumers want less intellectual property and the producers want more. I think that's a bad way of looking at it. Because when we come to these fields where there's a lot of cumulative innovation, where you are building a product on previous ideas, standing on the shoulders of giants, then what you have to recognize is that previous intellectual property has veto power on new intellectual property. And intellectual property has two sides. Yes, it's an incentive to innovate, but it's also a cost. When you're building on previous intellectual property, it's a cost of innovation. Patents can be a cost of innovation as well as a incentive for innovation. So think about a product, which builds. If we have a product which requires, 4 other patents in order to move ahead, built on 4 other patents, each one of those owners is going to say they want 30% of the profits. Then that's going to be a hard exchange to make.
It's tough.
But when we have 100 previous patents, each of them wants 10% of the profits, it's almost an impossible deal to make. The Coasian bargaining is really hard when you've got lots and lots of these people.
And just the pure
involved.
transaction cost of tracking down the 100 and contacting them and opening the negotiation process.
Exactly right. And so I think when we look at the big picture, that's where innovation is going to be slowed down. And it's also where what we need to tell the innovators is not this is a way of restricting your rights. It's a way of making innovation easier. It's a way of lowering the cost of your innovation. It's a way so that you don't need the permission of everyone else to innovate. We want people to stand on the shoulders of giants. As I say in the book, Newton might not have seen so far had he been required to pay for the privilege. So what we want to tell innovators, yes, go ahead and be the Newton, stand on the shoulders of giants, and you don't have to pay for that. We're all going to be able to see farther.
Yeah. It's an inspiring vision. What are the practical – so one way to practically implement that is to change, as you suggested earlier, the timing. So not every patent would get 20 years. Any other ideas on would you stop some things from being patented at all?
I mean, the remarkable thing is that the extension of patents to software and semiconductors and business methods and the broadening of the interpretation of these patents has been almost all judge-driven. So this is actually not legislation so much. It's judges. Judges have decided to interpret these patents in these broad ways, and they don't have to do that. So, the law actually hasn't changed that much. I talk a little bit in the book about Edison and the light bulb, and there actually was a previous patent, and the Sawyer and Mann had patented to make the incandescent filament any fibrous or textile material. Okay? And Edison came along and he tried 5,000 different materials before he hit on the one. Happened to be bamboo, and not just any bamboo, but bamboo that he had dispatched a man to Japan to find the right bamboo. So he had gone through all of these different types of materials, and yet Sawyer and Mann sued him and said, we have a patent on any fibrous material. And the court looked at that, and they said, no, this is crazy. They said, you can't give such a broad patent. Sawyer and Mann didn't actually investigate all 5,000 of these. And if we were to give such a broad patent, this would actually discourage innovation. So they said no to the Sawyer and Mann patent. They let Edison go ahead. We could do more of that today. The trouble today is we have not done what the judges did in the Sawyer and Mann case. We've said you can get a patent on any fibrous material to be analogously in many other fields. We've given these broad patents, and that actually discourages people from doing the real work of implementing, of actually creating a product. Now you can just patent an idea. It's like a science fiction author can patent ideas long before they're ever even possible to be implemented. You can patent the idea even before it's technologically possible. And that has actually discouraged innovation.
That's interesting. Let's move on to education, which is the next broad theme of your book. You argue that the American education system, both K through 12 and at the college level, has got some serious problems. So let's talk about it. What's wrong with And of course, as a result, since education is a key part of innovation and productivity, if you don't have a well-educated populace, you're not going to have a very good economy. What's wrong with our education system?
Let's start with K through 12. Here's two remarkable facts which just blow me away. Right now, in the United States, people 55 to 64-year-old, they're more likely to have had a high school education than 25 to 34-year-olds. Just a little bit, but they're more likely. So you look everywhere in the world, and what do you see? You see younger people having more education than older people. Not true in the United States.
So that is a shocking claim.
Incredible. Incredible.
And the reason is the dropout rate, I assume, has increased.
Exactly. So the high school dropout rate has increased. Now, 25% of males in the United States drop out of high school. And that's increased since the 1960s, even as the prospects for a high school dropout have gotten much worse. We've seen an increase. 21st century, 25% of males not graduating high school. That's mind-boggling.
Why, given one of the underlying facts in related to education, which has stayed true for over that whole 50 years, is that the more education you get on average, and I'm going to emphasize on average because we're going to talk about why on average can be very misleading, but on average, high school graduates do better than high school dropouts. People with some college do better than high school graduates. People who graduate from college do better than people who have some college. People with graduate degrees do better than college grads. And the differences are large, particularly if you compare a college graduate to a high school dropout. It's an enormous difference. So normally we would say, well, this problem kind of solves itself. There's a natural incentive to stay in school, and I really wouldn't worry about it. Why should we be worrying about it? It doesn't seem to be working. Why isn't it working, and what should be done? What could be done?
So I think there's a few problems. One is the quality of teachers has actually gone down. So I think that's been a problem. And this is a case of, every silver lining has a cloud or something like that, in that in the 1970s, about half of college-educated women became teachers. This is at a time when there's maybe, 4% are getting an MBA, less than 10% are going to medical school, going to law school. These smart women, they are becoming teachers. Well, as we've opened up, by 1980, we've got 30% or so of the incoming class of MBAs, doctors, lawyers are women. So these
which is great.
Which is absolutely great. Their comparative advantage moving into these fields, productivity, and so forth. And yet that has meant that on average, the quality of teachers, the pool which we are drawing from has gone down in terms of their SAT levels and so forth. So I think we need to fix that. Some conservatives are saying, it's all the unions and we need to crush the unions or something like, there's something to that. But my point of view is that actually
maybe not crush them. Let them get them out of the have them stand aside so that innovation can take place.
Right. You're much more politic than I. My point of view is that actually what we need to do is to pay teachers more. Now, we need to come up with a bargain where if we're going to pay more, then we need to test, we need to qualify, we need to make sure we are getting quality. We need higher standards.
We do pay them more. We pay them a lot more than we did in 1960, but we did it in a way that didn't guarantee we got better teachers. And you could argue we just didn't pay them enough more to compete with the alternatives, but I think it's worse than that. So if we doubled all teacher salaries tomorrow, they wouldn't become better teachers. The challenge is how do you encourage good teachers to be attracted to those higher wages and bad teachers to be rejected because they're not good enough.
Right. We paid them more, though we paid them less compared to those other fields that I was talking about that women now have an opportunity to go into. So it used to be a teacher and a lawyer starting off on day one have about the same salary. Today on day one, the lawyer's got 3 times the salary. So in terms of the opportunities which are available to smart people, we made teaching a much less desirable place for smart people to be.
Yeah, I'm not sure how important that is. It's an interesting point. We've had a lot of podcasts on education, and we'll put some links up to those. Encourage people who want to listen to more ideas on this to go ahead. But it just strikes me that if we think about K through 12, a lot of K through somewhere. I'm not sure it's where the second number is, but it's not 12. It doesn't require the skills of a great MBA legal medical mind. It requires a set of subtle, intangible skills that I'm not sure related to IQ to be a great teacher. Maybe high school math, you need bright people, and we don't do a very good job attracting math teachers. I think that's a problem. It's not obvious to me that the gray lining to that silver phenomenon of women going into more good-paying fields is the problem with our educational system. Is the problem with the way we teach our kids.
Well, I think it's one problem. I'm going to have to disagree with you a little bit on this point, in that I have 2 kids. And hard enough for me to manage 2 kids.
Yes.
The idea of managing 20 or 30 in a classroom, keeping them all interested in going forward and dealing with each one of their problems, I think that's a really tough job.
Oh, I think it's a very tough job. I just don't think IQ or the skills that say make someone a successful doctor are necessarily means that we don't have much of it. I don't think we need to take people out of medicine and keep them in the classroom.
Right, but those skills. But those skills, they do have alternative uses.
No doubt.
And if those alternative uses are being paid highly, then in order to get those skills, we need to draw from them.
I agree. I agree with that, obviously.
So the other part of it, so one part of it is, paying teachers more, but requiring more of these teachers as well. And the other part of it is, I think that we have sort of pushed one yellow brick road to education in our society. We've said the only type of education that matters is the sit down, sit on your hands, sit quietly, pay attention, listen to the teacher, absorb what they're saying, go to college, do this for 12 to 14 to 16 years, and that is the type of success which we count. It's the only type of success which we count. And I think
And the goal of high school is to aspire to do that for another 4 years somewhere else.
Exactly.
Harder classes, perhaps, but it's the same model.
Exactly right. And yet, it's not. We need to listen to the dropouts. The dropouts are telling us something important, because first they're dropping out of high school. Then a lot of them, even when the ones who make it to college, end up dropping out of college. So this type of learning, hard for a college professor to understand, but, some people think college is boring.
Strangely enough. Or high school algebra, yeah.
That's right. So what we need to do is to think about other types of education. People think that the only type of education is schooling, and it's particularly college schooling. But there's other types of education. And in Europe, here I think they've done a better job of creating more roads to a high school workforce. So in Germany and Finland and Switzerland, many of these other European countries, 40 to 70% of the kids in those countries opt for a high school program which involves some apprenticeship, involves some training. So it's workplace learning, which combines theory with practice. The students get paid. They are acculturated into the adult world. We don't block off all these teenagers into their own world. We introduce them into the adult world, and we provide them with skills. And these are not, in the United States, we think about these programs, vocational training is like shop class.
Being a mechanic.
Right. But there's a lot more to it than that. Being an optician, there's a new field called mechatronics. There's the field, the old term for it is, steam fitting, this pipe fitting. But when you actually look at it, it's massive operations control of how a modern factory works. So these are high skilled jobs, require a lot of intelligence, require a lot of creativity, but we don't reward that.
And to lead us into the college discussion, of course, when we have aspects of our college education system that are useful for those activities, we have to gussy them up with intellectual bells and whistles and window dressing to make it feel like it's scholarly. There's obviously a lot of practical things you have to understand to run a factory, to run a warehouse. We teach some of those things in business schools, but business schools that just do that would feel, well, that's just a trade. And so they have to have this intellectual pretension if we're going to have them in the university. And the same is true with legal education, right? Every lawyer I've ever met says, I didn't learn anything about being a lawyer in law school. What'd you learn? The theory of law. It's like interesting. You'd have 5 to 10 years, maybe more, of student debt to pay for something that isn't very useful. I mean, it's interesting. Maybe some people would like to pay for it, but that's the only road. We don't have a lot of vocational training in business and legal professions and elsewhere and other activities in the universities. We have it outside the university. I think I see the ads. I assume they're training some people. But a lot of what we do in college is not exactly what people would find most useful. It's interesting. Exactly.
We've divorced the world of work from college. And, we've made college, it's a great experience. I look at my own university, our university, and we have, 2 Olympic-sized swimming pools. We've got great athletic facilities. We've got restaurants on campus and things like this. But it's totally divorced from the work world.
Yeah. Well, let's turn to college now. You have some interesting observations about what's happened on college campuses educationally, particularly with respect to what people study. And I find it funny because, there's an enormous literature in economics where people look at the relationship between education and labor force outcomes, wages, compensation, salary. And the education variable that enters into the equation is inevitably years of schooling. As if each year it's like lifting weights. If you lift 50 pounds, you get stronger than lift 25. You lift 100, you get stronger than 50. So 12 years of schooling is more than 10, which is more than 8. But of course, in the data set are all these people who are studying radically different things, some of which guarantee you a very high paying job from the beginning, followed by some great appreciation, and others have no employability whatsoever. It's a very strange model. So talk about what's going on the college campuses with respect to what people are studying.
Yeah, I was amazed.
It's shocking that some of the numbers in your book.
Yeah, I was amazed when I looked into this data. So we think about, innovation and high tech and we think, computer science, right? Computers are exploding. The internet is exploding. And yet we graduated more students in computer science 25 years ago than we do today. Just
by a small amount, but it doesn't matter. The population is obviously radically larger today as a proportion.
Exactly.
But and the economy's bigger and there are more computers. So
Exactly. And the same thing is true in mathematics and statistics, in chemical engineering. You look at all of the so-called STEM fields, science, technology, engineering, mathematics, and we've stagnated. We're absolutely flat. What has grown? Well, one of the things, just to give an example, is the visual and performing arts. We graduated more students in visual and performing arts than in computer science, chemical engineering, and microbiology combined. And we've doubled the number of students graduating in visual and performing arts over the past 25 years at the same time as the STEM fields have been absolutely flat. So
communications are way up. Part of that's because there's a lot more jobs than there used to be in some of those fields, right?
Sure. So there's nothing I have nothing against
the explosion of the media world and entertainment in the United States has allowed people to major and study things that wouldn't have been very productive in the past.
Absolutely. So I think some of these things are good. Do I think some of the time we have sold students a bill of goods? So, we've doubled the number of students graduating in psychology, and yet in psychology, there aren't as many jobs in the entire country in psychology as we graduate every year. Yeah. So,
but obviously what's going on there is, that people are interested in psychology. They want to learn about themselves. They see the college experience as a exploration of the self and identity. People are between the ages of 18 and 21. That's a very attractive experience, and psychology seems like a normal way to do that. It's not the hardest field. The grading is relatively easy relative to those other fields we've been talking about. So a lot of people study it. They don't expect to get a job as a psychologist. You might ask them, what are they expecting to get a job in? That's a good question. But that's what they're doing. College compared to, say, 1950, where college was for people who wanted to go out and get a job, college today is an extended form, for some people, an extended form of adolescence, an opportunity to find one's way in the world. it's a very expensive way to do it. But that's clearly part of what's going on.
Yeah, I think that's right. So going back to all those athletic facilities and so forth, yeah, this is consumption good. And, there's no problem with a consumption good as long as you understand what you're buying. But also, it's the taxpayers who are subsidizing most of this education.
Yeah. On the grounds, by the way, the economists who invoked there's this externality. Well, there's not much of an externality if you go study, you pick it. I don't know, basket weaving. I'll pick something really.
No, that's absolutely right. There's very little evidence for a positive externality from higher education. Very little evidence overall. If there is an argument to be made, I think the best argument is for the science, the STEM fields. So if we're going to subsidize college education, I would have us subsidize the fields where there's most likely to be these positive externalities.
Can you imagine, Alex, that we told students entering George Mason University and the other 50-plus great, and many of them are great universities in many aspects of what they teach. So we're being a little tough on the schools, but let's face this possibility that we would tell people, well, if you come in and you want to study psychology, that's $25,000. If you want to study engineering, it's $5,000. That's going to be a tough sell to the body politic, I think.
Well, you're probably right, though. It's all. I guess maybe we do need some marketing managers to tell us how best to sell this idea. Maybe we should sell it as a discount. If you're willing to do, the science and the technology and help your country, then you get a discount on your education.
Yeah, actually, I think the externalities are small in general. I think the number of people who transform the world and add to both not just American well-being, but people around the world through their innovations, a very small number. The average graduate in the STEM fields is not doing that. So I'd say the argument for subsidy to start with is small, and we ought to be using prizes and other activities. You mentioned prizes early in the book, but other ways to incentivize the most gifted people in our society to go into those STEM fields and transform them. So,
yeah, of course, we do know that the creative people, instead of taking psychology, they do what Steve Jobs did and go to India for a few months, and that's not a bad thing to do either.
Yeah, well, and of course, we talked about dropouts, but there are a lot of great, wonderful contributors to the world who don't go to college and do all kinds of things. Some of which are in the headlines, but a lot of which are just part of being a successful person in life, being a good parent. I don't think we should oversell the importance of a high salary or a high standard of living for a country. There's a lot of things going on all around the world that are not measured, that are just as important. So going back to the college, though, in particular, and talking about these STEM fields. So one of the observations you're making, which I think is very important, obviously important, is the fact that college is not a solution in and of itself to people who worry about American competitiveness. And I think for special interest reasons, meaning people like us who are professors and the middle class who overwhelmingly benefit, not to poor, from the subsidies to college, there's always this groundswell of interest that the way we need to get out of our stagnation is more people need to go to college. Well, what you and I are saying, and you're saying, I agree with you, is that maybe too many going already, or if they are going, they ought to study something else.
Yeah, I think we need more education, but education is different than schooling. Yeah. And that's the thing which I think most people are failing to see right now.
So what other than hectoring people or differential pricing schemes, what else might be done to make some of these fields more attractive? Do we need to do anything? I mean, they already pay more.
Well, one of the problems in the university itself is grade inflation, because grade inflation has hit the arts and the social sciences much more than it has hit, mathematics and engineering and so forth.
A lot of which are, by the way, the gateway to, medical school, where they're going to weed out lots of people and they're going to use grades to do it.
Exactly. So if you want to be a lawyer, for whatever reason, it is true, the best thing to do is just get straight A's, while you're in college, And if that means you have to do it by taking, intro to history or psychology or something like that, rather than calculus 101, then that's the way to do it. Because in those history classes and so forth, you're much more likely to get that A. Now, so one thing we could do, if we could create a more even playing field in terms of grades, and there are ways of doing that. We can look at, for example, statistically, and say, okay, if this student got an A while they were in the history class, and they got a C while they're in the math class, while this student got an A in the math class and a B in the history class, we can even those out and create a overall grade.
Doesn't the market do that already? I mean, do we really need to worry about that? Don't people understand that history is a little bit the grading is easier in, say, psychology or history? I don't know if it is in history, but I've seen actual data on psychology and on some of the other social sciences. Everybody knows that. It's not a secret. Why do we need to reweight in some formal way? What's the big deal?
Yeah, I think it's surprising. I do think that there's a puzzle here, and I don't actually have the solution to this puzzle. But it is true that employers don't appear to pay as much attention as you and I would to what fields that students graduate, with some exceptions, of course. But either they find it too difficult to do, or they just look at where the person went to college. But I do think there's a puzzle there, and I'm not sure what the answer is.
Our colleague Brian Kaplan on our sister site EconLog often writes that there's very little value added at all to education. It's all signaling. It's all just that I don't care what major you majored in, as long as you got through, you showed the persistence. The only thing I'm paying for is that either you got into the school, which was a filter for quality, and then you got out because that meant you could do that weird thing called sit at the desk and write the papers and take the tests, and that's got some value. And so persistence and discipline, and I'm not that cynical. But there is part of that there. I think the other part comes back to what you talked about earlier, which is the quality of high school education. If high school math is badly taught, if high school science is badly taught, you're going to not get those people when they leave high school excited about studying them at those fields in a more rigorous and intense way in college. And I think that's part of the problem.
Yeah, that's a good point. If we can start at the bottom and improve people's education all the way along. An important point that I want to make about education, by the way, is there's probably no other area where we can have as much of a opportunity to increase innovation and increase growth than in education. I mean, just think about it this way. Almost all U.S. workers will go through the U.S. education system. Not all, but almost all U.S. workers will go through the U.S. education system. So think about if we improved our education system tomorrow. Well, at first, we're only going to get a small gain because only the new workers will come in under the new system. But as we get more and more workers coming in under the improved system, that means that we have 100 million people educated a little bit better. But 100 million people a little bit better, we are talking about trillions of dollars of potential gains there. So there's no other place, there's no other bottleneck where we can have as much influence on the U.S. economy or U.S. society than in the education system, because it's where all of our workers are going to be channeled at some point through that system. So we have a small change there means a big change overall over the next 40 years. That
sounds good. I'm not sure that's true. Coming back to what you said earlier, a lot of what we learn in life, we don't learn in a classroom. And so I'm not sure how. I think there are many, many ways that we become more productive and more knowledgeable and more skilled. And we figure those ways out. And we sometimes do that despite our education, and sometimes our education as well allows us to do it. So, I think it's fascinating. You think about your education and mine, right? We spent we logged a lot of hours in the economics classrooms as undergrads and graduate students. And we learned a lot there. Obviously, we learned a huge amount, but I'm amazed how much I've learned since then. Could argue that's what helped me learn how to learn. Certainly, there was a basic framework there, but we're in a really narrow technical field, economics. Somebody who goes through the standard K through 12 education system and then goes on to study, it doesn't matter what it is in college. I just have a feeling a lot of what they learned afterwards anyway. Maybe we ought to be shortening the whole process and getting people out into the world at an earlier age if they were mature enough. I don't know.
Maybe. I think there's some truth to that for college, for sure. For K-12, I think it's going to be more important. And I would say, you're right. People like you and I, who have alternative sources of education, our parents, our family, friends, our peer group, all of these things are working in our advantage. But for a lot of the kids in high school, they don't have those other factors working in their advantage.
Yeah, for
so
sure.
The one that we can really move, the one lever we have, I think we need to do everything we can to shift that lever.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. No doubt. Let's talk about government writ large. You have a provocative idea in the book that we need to get away from the what you call the warfare welfare state and toward a more innovative perspective in government's role. Talk about the warfare welfare state and what do you think we ought to be replacing it with?
Well, the warfare welfare state is really what we have in the United States. If we look at where we're spending our money, it's almost huge fraction is in warfare and in welfare. So you look
and
at
by welfare, you mean transfer payments, not just aid to the poor.
Right, not just aid to family or something like that. But you look at the big four: defense, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. These are a 60%, 70% of the budget, and this is all about transfer payments. It's all about dividing the pie. It's not about growing the pie bigger so much. It's all warfare and welfare. We don't even think about innovation. That's really often not even part of the agenda. The example I give is thinking about medical care, Obamacare. We had a huge debate over this. It was vociferous, people back and forth. Okay. Now, what do we know about medical care? Well, we know two things. We know, one, that a huge amount of medical care is wasted. I think everybody on both the right and the left agree with this point. If at a given point in time you can spend a lot or you can spend a little, and it just doesn't make that much difference. Look at Steve Jobs. Okay, Steve Jobs, one of the wealthiest people in the world, but he gets cancer. His survival probabilities are not that much higher than if you and I got cancer. All of that wealth does very little in the final analysis. We're all going to die, so it doesn't do anything in the final, but even a few years doesn't do him much.
I don't think Robin Hansen's so sure of that. We did do that podcast on the singularity. He's hopeful, cryogenics. Who knows? But let's work with. I'll work with you on that.
All right,
I'll go with you.
The second thing we know is that even though spending more at any given point in time doesn't buy you much, medical research actually seems to get you an awful lot. So the life expectancy in the United States has been going up a little bit every year. It's fantastic. Even simply looking at the gains from improved cardiovascular survivability, that's actually worth trillions of dollars. The fact that people are living longer is worth trillions. Not all of that is due to research.
Some of it's just eating better when they were younger.
Exactly, and so forth. But some of it is. So we have a potential to have trillion-dollar improvements by thinking about innovation. And yet, did that come up in the medical care, in the debate over Obamacare? No, it was all about how to divide the pie. It was all about, is the pie being divided equally? Does everyone have equal access to medical care? When thinking about it in terms of an innovation framework, it's how can we invest, research, and develop new things which are going to save our lives, which are going to extend lifespan. And the opportunities there are tremendous. And yet you look at the budget for the National Institutes of Health or the National Science Foundation, and we're talking, 30 billion, something like that. It's a very small amount compared to what we spend on warfare and welfare.
So some of my best friends work there too, at the NIH. They're great people. I have a huge respect for them. But is that money well spent? You say it's only 30 billion. If it were 60, you think we'd get a bigger, what you think we'd get more return?
I think it's much better spent than a lot of other things we spend on. And I do like, so you and I are certainly not, we certainly be in agreement that we don't want to try and centrally plan a science in any way. But if we think about what the NIH, the NSF, how they work, I think that's much more coheres with our kind of Hayekian way of viewing things, in that the money is not centrally planned. It's distributed by peers. So, people make proposals to the NSF, and the NSF gets a group of scientists and engineers, and they decide, okay, are we going to fund this or not? It's not perfect, plenty of problems, but the guy at the top is not making those decisions. It's a much more decentralized process.
Yeah, it's got a separate set of problems. There's groupthink, there's fads, there's people honoring their own work implicitly, the people who cite them. There's a lot of problems with it.
That's life.
I wonder what the question is, somebody like Michael Milken, who got prostate cancer and launched a very large effort to solve prostate cancer through my understanding is very innovative techniques and outside the box. Didn't go along with what the NIH was thinking. So I wonder, my this is not a presumption. I just don't have the data at my fingertips, but the amount of privately spent medical research money dwarfs what NIH. We spend an enormous amount on medical research. Now, people debate how much that's on marketing of new drugs or how much of it's just application rather than fundamental research, and that's obviously a relevant issue. But we spend a lot of money on R&D in America.
But
do I want more of it going through the government?
Well, I would like more. I would like to see the government budget shift from warfare and welfare towards innovation. So that's what I think we need to sell. Because that's a story which I think Americans intuitively understand. Americans are very forward-thinking, very progressive people. They like science. They're interested in a better future. They're thinking about the future. So I think we could sell an innovation state. And I'd much rather us have an innovation state than to be bombing
Libya,
many other countries. Well, you named it.
We stopped. I think Libya's over. It's okay.
Iran is next. You're behind the times. Yeah. So just to get people's mindset to change.
Of course, one argument against that would be that one of the major initiatives of the Obama administration has been the creation of innovation in the green area and environmentally friendly stuff that led to some disastrous. The story isn't fully unfolded yet, but the Solyndra example where money was a rather large sum of money, $500 million, was lent to a company that wasn't a viable institution at the time and turned out not to be able to pay it back. So
right. So that's exactly the type of centrally planned science which I'm not in favor of. So that was money going to a specific company with a specific idea, and at the final stages. I think the case for investing in much more basic science at a much earlier stage where it's open to many different people, again, peer-reviewed, not centrally planned, basic science, as well as from the universities. With all those, let's get those STEM graduates, let's get them into the universities, let's fund that a little bit more. That's where I think the case is to be made.
And again, STEM is science, technology, engineering, and math, right?
Right.
Are we in there? Economics, is that as part of the E?
We are not.
We're STEMish. I'd say we're STEM-like. We're STEMish. We're sort of serious, but
among the social sciences, inflation is much less in economics.
It's true.
We're much closer.
I've seen that at least in some data.
That's right.
The data I've looked at, it's been true. One thing you didn't talk about, which surprised me, is venture capital industry. So one of the things that distinguishes America from much of the rest of the world is venture capital. And in all this debate about the 1%, one of the great things about the 1%, wherever they get it from, and we've talked often on here, but that some of the 1%, and it's not the same people. It's not a fixed group, but some of the wealthiest people in America earn their money through making the world a better place, and some earn it by taking it from the rest of us through the political process. But either way, because they have large amounts of money, we have in America the opportunity for venture capital where wealthy people steer money into new enterprises. And that's rare. It's not common around the world. It is a huge source of innovation for America that, of course, benefits people around the world because a lot of the medical devices and innovations that are going on in technology in Silicon Valley, they're funded by people making a bet that if they make a bad bet, they lose all their money. If they make a good bet, they make an enormous amount. I love that system. I think it works well as long as we let both parts work, losses and profits. And my suspicion, and this comes from conversations I've had with venture capitalists, is that we've hamstrung, we've handicapped that industry recently through regulations that weren't designed to affect it, but of course ended up doing it perhaps unintentionally, such as Sarbanes-Oxley. So we made it much harder for small firms to go public. Small firms, venture capitalists I've talked to say that's not an option. Everybody now tries to get bought out rather than going public on their own. Get bought out by someone who's already incurred the fixed costs of Sarbanes-Oxley and the legal staff that does that. And that makes it harder to come up with. We've closed off our route for new products and new ideas.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of cases like that. I think about innovation as involving ideas, money, and markets. It's bringing all those three things together, which really matter. And the venture capitalist part of the industry is an incredibly important aspect of that. On regulation, more generally, I think we tend to evaluate regulations one by one. Is this a good idea? Is this a good idea? Is this a good idea? And yet, 1,000 pounds of feathers, each one of them is light, but the whole thing is still heavy. And you can have a lot of good regulations, which together is one bad, one heavy weight. And I think this is a problem in our mindset. Michael Mandel has a nice metaphor. He says, these regulations are like throwing a pebble into the stream. One pebble does nothing, but you keep throwing more and more pebbles, and pretty soon you block up the stream of innovation. And I see us, one of the big influences on my thinking has been Mansur Olson's Rise and Decline of Nations. What Mansur Olson talks about is this accretion of interest groups over time. And you get everyone is trying to divide that pie up more and more in their favor. And it slows down decision making. It makes things more bureaucratic. You need more committees in the small and in the large. And just look at what's going on in our politics. Look at something like the Hoover Dam. Okay, let's put aside big government project. Okay, let's just put aside that for the moment. Could we even build the Hoover Dam today? I mean, technologically, yes, we could do it, but politically, do we have the will to do something like that today? Or would there be so many environmental groups, and I'm not just blaming them, but so many lawyers, so many state and local governments, so many veto players. We have so many players now who can say no, and almost no one who can say yes.
And you talk about the example, I think is very telling in the book, is how little innovation there is in airport creation in the United States, right?
Absolutely.
You can't build an airport in America. It's almost impossible. You can't build an oil refinery. It's the costs are right now, for whatever reason. It could be because it's just not productive enough. It's hard to believe. It looks like it should be extremely valuable, but it's clear there are a lot of costs, perhaps worthwhile. But your point isn't that the costs aren't worth paying. Your point is that the nature of the costs are such that these interlocking aspects of it mean that the real cost is bigger than any one piece of it.
Exactly. I mean, the real cost is getting all these groups together to an agreement, which is almost impossible. And just think about the infrastructure that we have. A huge amount of our infrastructure was built in the 30s and the 40s and the 50s, thinking about the interstate highway system and so forth. But we cannot rely on the infrastructure of our past to take us to the future. We need to build our own infrastructure. And right now, I just don't see us even being capable of doing that. I go to China, and you see in China building going on everywhere, highways. And yeah, I know the highways are running through some poor farmers' land.
They're out of control, Alex. Yeah, it could be a good thing we're not building our own infrastructure anymore. We got too much of it already, maybe. Go ahaid. They don't have any. It's true, they don't have any zoning laws, which I hate. We had a nice conversation with Ryan Avon about that. How much these bureaucratic interlocking things keep innovation from happening. Forget innovation, development is a simpler word here.
That's right.
But on the other hand, going to a world where a central cabal is able to
It doesn't have to be public. I mean, think about the Keystone pipeline. You're not able to build that. So there's a lot of private infrastructure, which has simply become too expensive, takes too long to build. I mean, we can build these airports privately, but it's just not possible. And here we have a massive increase in air traffic in the United States and this tiny bottleneck of airports where we cannot build another one. The last one we built was Denver.
Which was when?
Which is like 78 was the starting of it, something like that.
Uh-huh.
Wasn't completed till many years later.
I think it was a couple weeks ago.
Yeah. Some people are still looking for their luggage.
Yeah, no doubt. Yeah, there's some problems. I remember that.
Meanwhile, China is building like 10 to 100 airports every year. That's not a way to take us in the 21st century.
I think they I semi-agree. And I think Chinese and Japan also, by the way, there's Keynesian zeal. They seem to like concrete a lot. So they're pouring a lot of concrete in those places, some of which is, I think, because the people who pour the concrete have a lot of friends. But we're almost out of time. Let's talk. Why don't you finish? You make some recommendations at the end of the book, some of which we've touched on. Why don't you list them and just talk briefly about the ones we haven't talked about?
Sure. So we talked a lot about patents. And, I think we just expanded our patent system too much. We need to prune back on patents to actually leave room for more growth. We need to pay teachers better, and in return, we need to demand better teachers, more accountability. And this means more charters, means more vouchers, more private schools as well, a more competitive, flexible, and open system. We've pushed college as the totem, as the only way to be educated. It's one way of being schooled. It's not the only way of being educated. We need to think more about alternative ways of education, including apprenticeship programs and including focusing college education more on the STEM fields. We didn't talk much about immigration, perhaps because high-skilled immigration, I think, is such an obvious, such a completely clear thing to do that it's shocking that we haven't done it already. We have, it's easier. It's literally easier to win the lottery than it is for a person of advanced and high skills to get a visa into the United States. And what I mean by that is we give out more visas in the lottery program, random allocation, than we do to these people of extraordinary ability. Now that's insane. How can you have a system like that where you just randomly give out visas and there's more of them than you give to people of extraordinary ability? That's crazy. We need to cut back on regulation, and we need to think about, as I said, regulation as not simply thinking about regulation as each regulation comes up. We need to think about the pebbles in the stream. We need to think about what happens when you accrete, what happens when these things build up. And I would like to see us change our mindset from the warfare-welfare state towards innovation. I do believe that Americans are an innovative people. They're a forward-thinking people. They believe in making the pie bigger rather than in fighting over dividing the pie. So I would like to see a politics which emphasizes innovation more than it does all these other things we've been talking about.
My guest today has been Alex Tabarrok. Alex, thanks for being part of EconTalk.
Thank you.
This is EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. For more EconTalk, go to econtalk.org, where you can also comment on today's podcast and find links and readings related to today's conversation. The sound engineer for EconTalk is Rich Goyette. I'm your host, Russ Roberts. Thanks for listening. Talk to you on Monday.